Well, the statistics tell the story. Religion is in trouble. In the industrialized countries of the West, religion is seen as old-fashioned and quaint and boring and maybe even demonic. Religion is seen as the source of the problem and not part of the solution. Religious attendance and membership have been on a downward spiral since the 1960s and have been plummeting since the 1990s. The fastest growing religious affiliation in the United States is none. And approximately 1 out of every 4 Americans agrees with the statement that I am spiritual but not religious. People say that they love Jesus, but just not the church of Jesus Christ. On a recent study of Americans aged 18 to 35 years old, the research found that this younger generation, who overwhelmingly identifies themselves as spiritual but not religious, has no use for religion, for the church, because they perceive the church, religion, to be pushing a political agenda. They feel that the church is full of judgmental people who are always negative about life and the world. They think that the church is dominated by males and oppressive to females. They think that the church is thoroughly homophobic. They think that the church is arrogant in claims that they are exclusively right and everyone else is wrong. And they think that the church is full of unyielding people who want to shove the Bible with their specific interpretation down people's throats. Well, with these perceptions, no wonder it's popular to identify with the spiritual but not religious crowd. And seemingly today we have the perfect Bible passage to sum up spiritual but not religious. Jesus cleanses the temple. Here we have no wimpy, girly man Jesus, Jesus meek and mild, turning the other cheek and crying like a baby at the death of Lazarus, his friend. Jesus wrapping a towel around his waist and washing the feet of his disciples. Here, you and I encounter one of the most violent and unsettling images of Jesus from the Bible. Jesus comes into the outer courts of the temple, into the entryway, and he loses it. Jesus angrily overturns the tables of the money changers. He scatters their coins on the floor. He chases away the cattle and sheep and doves which were used for sacrifice. John tells us that Jesus had a whip in his hand, no doubt snatched away from one of the cattle drivers, and he is busy cleansing the temple. And the question before you and me this morning is, what on earth are we to make of this story? What is so important about Jesus cleansing the temple that it is remembered by Matthew and Mark and Luke and John? Well, at first glance, you and I might jump on the spiritual but not religious bandwagon. We might agree with those who say, see, look, proof positive. Jesus wants nothing to do with religion. Jesus is out to destroy religion, the temple, and get people back to an unfettered, unmediated personal relationship with God. Jesus, like a growing number of Americans, is spiritual, but not religious. Well, you could go that way. But this morning, I'd like to offer a slightly different scenario. What if Jesus' cleansing of the temple was just that? A cleansing, not a rejection or an overthrow. What if Jesus was trying to do, what if he was trying to do was to reestablish the temple, reestablish religion, indelibly connect the spiritual and the religious and the spiritual. You see, it seems to me that Jesus isn't trying to do away with the temple and religion. After all, Jesus had chosen to go there to worship. Jesus is simply trying to reestablish the temple, religion, that church is to be fundamentally a house of prayer for all people and not a marketplace. Jesus' vision of the earthly temple of organized religion, it seems to me, is that it should be a place where God dwells, unmarred by the crass intrusions of the world, including livestock sales and currency exchanges. Jesus was shocked that temple worship religion, the faith, was being torn away from its spiritual roots and foundations. So when Jesus saw what was going on in the temple, his rage got the better of him. And he grabbed a whip and he chased away the commercial interests for the sake of restoring the temple to a house of prayer for all people. A house that might more rightly reflect and be fit for God. If Jesus thought the temple should be a place of communion, a house of prayer, a meeting place of the soul and spirit, uniting heaven and earth, a sanctuary where nothing should interfere with encountering God, a place where the spiritual and the religious are inextricably bound, then why shouldn't you and I expect the very same? Well, of course, it's impossible for you or me to leave the world completely behind us, nor should we use the sanctuary, worship, our faith as a place to escape reality, to avoid taking responsibility for our lives, to revert to a kind of spiritual infantile dependency. Nor is faith, the spiritual, meant to be compartmentalized and separated from the rest of life. Religion is not some kind of personal devotional exercise that we pull out on Sundays and dress up and play with at church, only to pack back away once worship is over. There's too much of that already going on. Isolating faith, as if Monday has not been preceded by Sunday. But if you and I can't find in our faith, our religion, our worship, in the temple, some sense of peace, some hope for life, some inspiration for the living of our days, then where on earth can we find it? Here in this place, you and I should be able to hear God's word read and proclaimed. We should be able to confess to God our need for God's help and receive the inspiration that sustains us. We should find here nurturing and restoration so that we can live our lives more fully beyond these walls, centered on the one who is our peace and security. Psalm 122 reminds us that I was glad when they said to me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing in your gates, O Jerusalem. This is a song that was most probably sung as a chant while people were going up the steps into the temple, preparing to enter the sanctuary. They were filled with anticipation and joy, thinking of the goodness of being in the holy place so close to God. I was glad when they said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord. Well, this may not be exactly the description you might make of your arrival at Starmount this morning, with an hour less sleep because of springing forward, and with maybe your reluctant 14-year-old in tow, whose ears are plugged with an iPad and whose thoughts are full of other things than joy at climbing the steps to the sanctuary. Yet for many of us, this very place, these walls evoke a peacefulness, an inspiration, a grace, the presence of Almighty God that keeps us going from day to day and from week to week. And so it is for people who find in a particular church, a particular faith tradition, a particular congregation and sanctuary, holy space. The sanctuary of the church is one of the few places in our harried and hurried world where you and I may indeed feel centered and at peace, where it's possible to hear from God or God to hear from us. There's something about a house of worship, a place of prayer that hallows its own space within our lives and connects us to something holy, something spiritual, something good. Here within these sacred walls, the grace of God is made real to us. We discover the presence of God among us in ways that just aren't possible at other times and in other places. Well, you may remember the story of Jacob. After he had stolen his brother Esau's birthright, the blessing due Esau, but which Jacob stole by dressing up with hairy gloves so that it might trick his father into thinking he was the older brother Esau. After Jacob had stolen that birthright, he had to run from his brother. And while Jacob was running away, Jacob lay down to rest with a stone for a pillow, and he had the dream of a ladder with angels going up and down where he was. There he heard the voice of God, the voice of blessing and promise, and said to him that his offspring and future would be blessed. When Jacob awoke, he realized that that was the place that he was in. That unlikely place by the side of the road had become holy because he had met God there. And Jacob said, surely the Lord was in this place and I did not know it. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God and the gate of heaven. Jacob took the stone on which he lay his head and poured oil on it and dedicated it as an altar to the Lord because he had encountered God there. Well, I don't know if Starmount Presbyterian, this sanctuary, is such a place for you. If you happened here for the first time on Invite a Friend Sunday, maybe not. Not yet. But the builders of this great space intended this place to be the very gate of heaven. For they inscribed in our cornerstone the verse from Genesis, "This is none other than the house of God and the gate of heaven," as a witness and a hope and a prayer. Because if the story of Jacob tells us anything, it tells us that sometimes places become holy, and not for the very obvious reasons, but for reasons that are hidden deep within our hearts. And sometimes it takes time for that to happen because everything depends on what you and I associate with that place, what we've experienced there, and who has been there with us. Well, lovers know this, that transformations can happen in certain locations, that special meetings can attach an otherwise special meaning to an ordinary place. It's why some hole-in-the-wall Mexican restaurant or a random city park or a seedy movie theater can become one of the most romantic places on earth to a couple. Because it was there that they first realized that they were falling in love. It's why a piece of dirt, 8 by 4, becomes sacred ground not like any other. Because someone dear to our heart has been laid in that soil for the remainder of remembered history. And a stone has been set up to mark the dates of living and dying. The holiness of a place depends on what you and I associate with it, what we've experienced there, and what it has been, who has been there with us. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The unremarkable becomes remarkable. The religious becomes spiritual because of what happens there and with whom. And so it is with sanctuaries and holy places, cathedrals and country churches, because there God has met us or met others in a place marked and set aside and hallowed by memories, with times and dates that can be recalled and moments that you and I remember. And we find ourselves saying, surely the Lord was in this place and I didn't know it. And so over time, a sanctuary, a temple becomes a treasured meeting place, a well of spiritual strength from which we drink again and again. Because there we have experienced God's presence. Because there we have experienced something out of the ordinary. People sometimes tell me at the door not only what they think about the sermon, but also why they have come here, or why they stay here, or why they have returned.